Mervin Jebaraj is an economist with the UA Walton College of Business, and he's the director of the Center for Business and Economic Research there. I caught up with him earlier to discuss moves by the feds, moves by the state, and much more. All right, Mervin, let's begin with the latest gross domestic product reading. We got those numbers earlier this week, negative 4.8%, and that was not even bad for the quarter. It was worse than what some economists expected. How much worse can it get? What do you think of these numbers that came out this week?
Well, I certainly think that the negative 4.8% GDP decline is sort of a preview of what's to come. If you're looking at the statistical carnage that will be the second quarter GDP figure that we'll get at later this year. So, 4.8% sounds like a large number. It is a large number. It's certainly one of the most dramatic declines we've seen in GDP, at least, but it hasn't beat sort of the 8.5% or so that we saw in one quarter in the last recession. So it's going to get worse. It's not going to get better in the second quarter. At the scale of how bad it gets is really where the question is. And I think when you look at the 4.8% decline in GDP that they reported a couple of days ago, it is based on preliminary data. A lot of the sources where the federal government, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, gets this data from companies based on how many sales they made, et cetera. All of those companies are probably closed and delayed in responding. So as the federal government gets more data, it is very likely that that 4.8% decline will be revised up. Now, if you look at where exactly in the current data that they have that the decline really came from, roughly about half of it came from healthcare, which is a shock to a lot of people, given that a lot of people are getting treated for the coronavirus. But just about every other category of healthcare spending has gone down. So people are not getting treatments for a wide variety of other ailments. Certainly a lot of elective procedures have gone, and then visits to eye doctors, dentists, all of those are down as well. And so all of those contributed to about half the decline in the overall GDP decline that we saw of 4.8%, and it contributed a huge portion to the overall consumption expenditures from consumers in this quarter. Another huge part of that decline came from obviously sales at restaurants and other food service establishments, and again, that's no surprise, but a large part of that just happened at the end of March and is likely to be worse because most of these establishments have been closed or operating at a very, very reduced scale through all of the month of April. And really the statistics, or the carnage in terms of economic statistics, really began in the middle of March, so it's not fully reflected yet in how bad this will show up in the statistics. The one thing to point out, though, is that we like to confuse people on a regular basis as economists. So the 4.8% decline is seasonally adjusted at annualized rates, and that means you've accounted for seasonal variations in the GDP, which is not a big deal, but the 4.8% decline assumes that the economy throughout the rest of the year looks like it did in the first 3 months of that year. So that's why you get a huge decline of 4.8%. The actual decline between the fourth quarter of 2019 and the first quarter of 2020 was about 1.2%, but the 4.8% is simply if the economy throughout 2020 looked like the first 3 months, you would get a 4.8% annual decline in the US GDP. So the next quarter, I'm going to warn all your viewers, that number is going to be massive, and that number means that if the economy looked like April, May, and June for the rest of the year, that's what that massive decline is going to be. So it's an annualized figure, so take that with a little grain of salt. It is still bad, but maybe not as bad as that headline number suggests.
The Federal Reserve officials have been meeting this past week. They really didn't come out and do anything new. They've done a lot previously. Tell me, what do you think that they have done that has been critical or crucial to propping up the economy?
So what the Federal Reserve has done, probably of all the different government institutions here in the United States, probably gets the best grades on their response to the coronavirus pandemic and the economic crisis that it precipitated. And so I think it's fair to say at this point that the Federal Reserve has thrown everything but the kitchen sink at the crisis. At some point, I think someone added up all the different programs, and it amounts to more than $6 trillion worth of support to the economy. And so what the Federal Reserve does best is lend money and make sure that the financial system operates at a regular level, given that there is a global pandemic going on. And so a lot of the programs that the Federal Reserve has instituted and started early on, in addition to the interest rate cut that started in March, has been to maintain the liquidity within the financial system, and that means that they have made sure that remains a market for a wide variety of bonds. A lot of companies, for example, finance their day-to-day operations with corporate bonds. These are typically unsecured bonds, and they have a very robust market for these bonds, which is how companies finance themselves. But in any economic crisis, that market usually dries up, so the Federal Reserve stepped in to buy those commercial bonds. Similarly, state and local governments in particular are going to see the market for municipal bonds, for example, dry up as investors are hesitant to get into purchasing municipal bonds that are necessary for local governments to function, maintain the infrastructure projects, etc., because they're worried about where the sales tax cuts to municipal budgets will affect the bonds. So the Federal Reserve has stepped in to purchase municipal bonds as well, which is a very important aspect there. And then the Federal Reserve has stepped in to provide loans to larger companies. So the Paycheck Protection Program, broadly provides loans to smaller businesses. Even though the definition of small business is rather loose, it still doesn't provide loans to truly large businesses or mid-sized businesses that don't qualify under paycheck protection. And so the Federal Reserve has stepped in to provide a series of loans to larger companies, ensure that they're able to hold on to their employees with low-interest loans as well. And then finally, that the Federal Reserve has also agreed to purchase some of the paycheck protection loans from banks and provide capital to banks to make those loans to smaller businesses. So all in all, the Federal Reserve has maintained the liquidity in the financial system so far, made sure that the financial system did not choke up and add and exacerbate the ongoing crisis from the coronavirus pandemic. And I think it's important to also remember there's a lot of misperceptions about what the Federal Reserve does. The Federal Reserve, unlike the federal government, can't give money to people. The Federal Reserve lends money to people, and so the Federal Reserve has indeed lent money to a lot of different financial institutions, to companies directly, and through a variety of different markets to make sure that the financial system is stable. But that's, again, as you saw during the press conference, they indicated that that's not going to be enough to just lend money, that they need the federal government to step in and grant money to people and businesses.
Lots of talk about extra unemployment compensation, as well as for those that have been laid off, as well as hazardous pay for essential workers. Separate some fact from fiction for me out there. A lot of people think people are gaming the system. Do you think that that's what's happening, or is this just part of what's necessary to keep the economy running?
I certainly think that this was part of what's necessary to keep the economy going, and it was certainly designed in such a way to provide fast relief. The state unemployment systems, as we've all seen, were not built to handle this volume of claims all at once, which has resulted in people having to wait for a very long period of time to get their unemployment benefits. Typical unemployment benefits in Arkansas usually account to up to 45% of your typical paycheck, so it doesn't cover all of your paycheck. And what the federal government wanted to do is make sure that in this crisis, everybody got their whole paycheck from the unemployment benefits and not just 45% of their paycheck from the unemployment benefits. Could they have designed a system where you actually got just 100% instead of designing it to be $600 flat, to where some people are getting more than what they used to get from their regular paycheck? Yes, but I think the federal government saw how long it was taking states to just process the claims. It would take them even longer if they were to try to figure out for each individual employee what 100% of their paycheck was on average and give them that specific amount from week to week. So the federal government figured it's just faster to give everybody $600, and that gets most people to about 100% of their paycheck, and some people to more than 100% of their paycheck. So it wasn't designed to distort the market or do anything like that. It was designed to provide fast support because state unemployment systems are built on really old software, not really nimble to deal with the crisis as it is today. Obviously, that is something that we will need to address in the future, but it was not something that we could have fixed in the short run, and that's why they came up with the system of payments. Now, on the other side of this, obviously, we are providing hazard pay to healthcare workers in Arkansas, but we're not providing hazard pay to other frontline workers that are necessary to maintain some level of economic activity and normalcy, especially grocery workers and stuff. And so you've seen some companies come out with bonus pay for those essential workers, but it's not been in any organized fashion, and it's not certainly been all frontline workers receiving hazard pay. So I think it is important to consider that as we think about opening businesses in Arkansas and around the country. Especially as we bring people in, there is still some risk to workers working in those fields that we're bringing in. And I think the best way to internalize those risks is to provide hazard pay for those workers. So if we think that bringing them back to work with hazard pay is worth it economically, we will. And if it's not, we won't, and we'll bring them back when it's safe.
Let's talk about what's going on at the state level. Governor Asa Hutchinson making a series of announcements this week, from state parks to restaurants to gyms, fitness centers, in terms of some scheduling for reopening. More is on the way in the next week. I'll throw in elective surgeries for hospitals as well. What are you going to be watching for? What will you be watching for as the state seeks to reopen business?
There are two important things to watch for. Obviously, I think when you look at surveys of consumers, there has been sort of a loud, vocal minority of people arguing that everything should be open and go back to normal. But if you just look at overall surveys of consumers, the vast majority of people think that the measures currently put in place are right for where we are with the coronavirus pandemic. So the things that I'm going to be looking for are whether or not we have enough testing capability in this state to provide tests for everybody that needs to get tested before they can get back to work. I don't know that we're quite there yet. And that we have enough staff on hand for contact tracing. I think there are a couple of studies out in the past week or so that try to measure how many people states would need to hire to maintain an effective contact tracing regime. And we're nowhere close to having those number of people hired by the state and ready to do that work. I think it's going to require eventually, some of these estimates suggest that we might require to about 2/3 of what we would hire typically for carrying out the census. So we do need a large number of people to do contact tracing before we can systematically open various parts of our economy up. And the last thing I'm going to be looking for is to see how many people actually go out. I think you'll see maybe an initial surge in people trying to go out to businesses that are allowed to be open over the next few weeks, but then they may not be comfortable with how many the crowds they see or the setup that they see, and how it's not actually normal again. And there are obviously a whole slew of questions within there about how exactly a party size of 10 would work in a lot of restaurants that might just take up the entire capacity, how reservations work, what are the cleaning regimens in between customers, how often do employees change protective equipment in between moving from one table to another table, who's regulating all of these things, who's checking to make sure that all of these are going per guidelines. So there are a whole lot of questions. So I think you might see slow adoption from businesses, not quite taking it up immediately, waiting and seeing how other businesses are proceeding before they open up their dining rooms to allow people in.
Bonus question for you here. Lots of speculation that there may not be college football this fall. I don't mean that as a throwaway kind of first world problem type of question there, but what would the ramifications be, not only for Northwest Arkansas, but for the nation? This has got some serious economic ramifications.
It certainly does. So, nationally and internationally, we've seen sporting events ground to a halt, and obviously those sporting events also, in addition to providing us entertainment, support a lot of different jobs, especially in the retail sector and hospitality sector. So all of that has gone away in the short run here, and it is very unclear that at this point we would be able to have these types of large sporting events without a vaccine that is reliable and safe and effective for the population. So again, we might get into a variety of different places of public accommodation operating at 50-80%, but I'm not sure that we're quite ready to put 50,000 people in a stadium anywhere, or even 20,000 people in a stadium close together. So obviously this affects athletic departments and sports franchises and their budgets. The SEC on average gets about 22%. The athletic departments in the SEC get about 22 or so % of their revenues from ticket sales. So if we're going to be playing games without fans, that's a huge revenue hit to those SEC programs and programs around the country as well. In Arkansas, at the University of Arkansas, for example, I think gets about 30% or close to about 30% of their revenue, overall revenue, from ticket sales. For the football program itself, that's about 40% of the football program's revenue comes from ticket sales. Now, obviously, those figures were from 2018 when the team did a little bit better than they did last year, so those numbers are probably going to be lower from 2019, and maybe emptier stadiums is not going to look particularly different in 2020 compared to the 2019 season for the University of Arkansas. But nonetheless, it is a huge revenue hit to the university, to the athletic department, and in particular to those businesses that rely on the fans coming in and spending money at restaurants, at bars, and at hotels. So, in a good year when the team was doing well, each game brought in about $5 million from Northwest Arkansas. In sort of a mediocre Brett Bielema year, the team was bringing in $4 million worth of, leisure and hospitality type economic impacts in Northwest Arkansas. I don't know what it was last year, but anecdotally it sounded like it was really bad. In very many cases, restaurants and bars had more opposing team fans than University of Arkansas fans. So if we're operating without fans, a lot of those restaurants that depend on, really large sales in the fall to make up a huge part of their overall annual picture are not going to see that, and it's going to be a big loss to them.
When homemade is too good to keep at home. Helping Arkansas business do business. Making better happen with First Security.
You'll find us at the end of a lot of long country roads, covering over 60% of the great state of Arkansas. Our 17 electric distribution cooperatives are working day and night to provide reliable, affordable power to over 500,000 homes, farms, and businesses, just like yours. The Electric Cooperatives of Arkansas, your local energy partners.